We're here to celebrate the wonderful Pete Betts, and who we lost a little while ago, and we will celebrate it by discussing and talking seriously about a subject which was very close to his heart and on which he made an absolutely enormous contribution, and that was international action on climate change. And to do that, we have 4 people here, and we have Fiona McGregor, Pete's partner, on my left. We have Ed Miliband, who's Secretary of State at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And I mean, Pete worked for him, but we all know that if Pete was there, then you work for Pete. And we all worked very hard for Pete. And Kyte Hughes, who is essentially Pete's successor as lead negotiator, with a long history in this, including a key role in the Glasgow COP26. And we have Rachel Kyte, who is the UK's special representative for climate, with a stellar career at the World Bank and at the UN on energy for all and so on. And I'm delighted to say all of them close personal friends. So welcome here and welcome to the LSE. I'm not going to give any further biographical information. There's something that I missed in your burning to tell us. Then include it in your remarks. So we celebrate Pete by talking seriously about what he contributed so much towards. We've all got our personal memories of Pete. I'm going to do just one. I arrived in the Treasury, UK Treasury, in 2003 with 3 potentially crippling defects. I was an outsider above all. I was technically competent, and I had some international experience. Now, together, these 3 could have been fatal, but fortunately, Pete was one of my close reports, and Pete understood the Treasury. He was street smart as well as seriously smart on all fronts. And Pete recognized that other people had feelings and anxieties. I certainly did. And Pete was there, and Pete guided me through. Now, that's my little one. We've all got these Pete stories, and I could go on. But as well as recognizing his enormous contribution, as I just described, the personal side was so important to all of us who knew and worked with him. So I'm told that I have to tell you that if there is a fire alarm, it is serious. There is no planned fire alarm that exercise. So if it goes off, then leave. Brilliant. Thank you. So that's my words by way of introduction. We're going to ask Fiona and then Ed to speak, and then Rachel will give her thoughts and address, and then Kyte Hughes will look after the Q&A. So there we are, looking forward to a really splendid evening. And Fiona, please.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. I'll be very brief because I know less about climate than anybody else in this room, I think. I want to just start by saying some thank yous. Firstly to Ed Davey, not lived in Ed Davey, in the front here for organising today, and to Bob over here for so kindly offering and sorting out all of the LSE hosting. To Kate for moderating, to Nick for all of your support and help with all of this, to Rachel for giving the lecture, and to Ed for making the time to be here. I'm really, really grateful to all of you. This is such a great way to remember Pete, And I have to say, for me, it's an enormous comfort. And thank you to all of you for coming, because it really does mean a huge amount. And it's a source of great pride. Pete would have loved it. It's a shame he can't be to see it. But I don't want to preempt what people will say or what they're able to say. I'm conscious of the hats that people might be wearing. We spoke last year a little about the fact that Pete never gave up, no matter how rough things got. He never gave up on making the case for ambition in tackling. And even more than last year, I think, and I think I am allowed to say this, this is not the time to give up. Things have got tougher than ever. But I'd encourage everyone to keep pushing really hard globally to address the climate challenge. Hopefully it's not too late. And on the theme of never giving up, many people know that Pete decided, as soon as he was diagnosed actually, to write a book, and that book would be about climate change and what he knew. And he worked relentlessly on that during the last 18 months of his life. Some of us worked very hard for him, as Nick's already said as well, but he worked really hard on it. And I'm now going to be utterly shameless and say I'm so delighted that over the last year and a bit, with the work that others have put into it, we now have both a publisher and a date for publication, which is the 28th of August this year. And that's to coincide with the 10th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. There are loads of people, many of you are in this room, to thank, but we'll do that in due course, otherwise I'd be here all night. So for now, I just want to shamelessly plug the book. It's a brilliant book. I would say that. I'm utterly biased. I think it's great. But Pete wanted to pass on his knowledge and his views. He always had views. And it's kind of his final words, really, his final act. And those who know him will know that Pete always had something to say. So this is his last something to say. And in that vein, it would be great if the book was really widely read and as many people as possible heard what his final things to say were. So please, there are flyers on the chairs. I'd like all of you to sign up for pre-purchase of the book. Could you get as many of your friends and colleagues and just everybody you know to do the same? If your organisation or your institution wants to do bulk purchases, that would be utterly fab. And if anybody's got any ideas or suggestions for promoting it, just give me a shout and contact me. But thank you so much. I'm going to hand you over now to Ellen.
Well, Fiona, thank you so much. Can I start by thanking the LSE, the World Resources Institute, Ed Davey, and you, Nick, for hosting us here today. Fiona, I particularly want to thank you for your bravery, your friendship, and your all-round goodness. And you know, in really bleak circumstances, I think for all of us who worked with Pete, it's been such a privilege to get to know you even better than we did before over these last few years. So thank you, Fiona, and maybe we can show our appreciation for Fiona. I look around the room and I see lots of people who did know Pete, but there'll be some people who didn't know Pete, and maybe this is a bit addressed to them. Pete Betts was an amazing person. He was he thought deeply, he cared deeply, he felt deeply about people, and he also did very good impressions of Gordon Brown when angry. Not Pete angry, Gordon. But you know, I met him on my first day in the then Department of Energy and Climate Change, and I could see this was somebody who I needed to follow and listen to, and that's what I did throughout the time when I was Secretary of State.
in the sort of disasters of Copenhagen, he was a kind of guide and a mentor, and the person who rang me up when I hadn't slept in 36 hours and rang me and said, the deal is going down the toilet, you better come back. And sort of Gordon Brown was ringing in my ears because he'd said just before he left, right, well, we've done the hard work, don't screw it up now. But Pete was somebody who showed incredible leadership, and I thought often of Pete at COP29. And for those of you who don't know, we had and have an amazing civil service team who work on these issues, and I'm incredibly glad that Kyte is with us today. The team was then led by Alison Campbell, and honestly, it is no overstatement to say this was a team that is so admired around the world. I mean, people often wanted Britain to play a role in these talks in the 2 weeks we were there, and it wasn't anything to do with me. It was to do with the fact that we had this brilliant team, and they wanted access to the team, and they wanted the work of the team. It is one of the best adverts I can imagine for what a good civil service can do. And the thing I want to say in connection to Pete is this team was idealistic, pragmatic, bridge building, working all hours, admired around the world, and I felt so inspired and honestly emotional every day working with them. And I was discussing this with somebody, and I said, God, this team is amazing. The culture, it's just everything they do is amazing. And she said, of course you know why they're like that. And I said, well, why are they like that? Because so many of them work for Pete. And suddenly it all made sense to me. It was the team that Pete built, the ethos that Pete built, the house that Pete built. And that's why we miss Pete so much, I say to Fiona and to everybody. But it is really important to say that that showed to me that Pete lives on, not just in our hearts, but in the work that hundreds of people do in my department and thousands of people around the world. And he also lives on in our lecturer today, and it is an absolute pleasure to introduce Rachel Kyte, who is our brilliant special representative for climate. And the theme of her lecture couldn't be more timely. We're in the decisive years for delivering on the ambitions of Paris. The world is way off track from where we need to be, and the fight is on when it comes to this agenda. And Rachel, you are a remarkable asset for Britain and the world in the fight. So many people from countries around the world admire you so much. The general look I had in people's eyes was when I would walk into meetings with Rachel at COP29 was, well, you must be okay because Rachel works for you, or rather, you work for Rachel. And that is because of Rachel's incredible record of work, her ingenuity, her experience on crucial issues around finance, her deep, deep values, and also, and this is the reason I was most keen, David Lammy and I were most keen to have her, was because of her courage and her willingness to speak truth to power. And I imagined rightly speaking truth to power in Whitehall and elsewhere. So we're incredibly fortunate to have Rachel as part of our team. Please join me in welcoming our lecturer tonight, Rachel Kyte.
Thank you very much to Fiona and to Ed. Thank you, Ed, for your tremendous leadership over the years. You know where we are if you need any help in the coming months. And Fiona, thank you so much for bringing Pete with you every time we see you. And it's been such a, as Ed said, getting to know you has been one of the pluses of this great loss. So thank you very much, Fiona. Rachel, please.
Thank you.
Actually, speaking truth under power, you have to recognize this is also power.
Good evening, Secretary of State, boss, colleagues at the LSE, to the organisers, and Fiona in particular. Thank you for bestowing on me the honour of delivering the second Pete Betts Memorial Lecture. Pete, in the years running up to the Paris Agreement, I was working for the World Bank Group, where the French, as an effective shareholder, placed immense pressure on me and my team to find solutions to the challenge of financing climate action. Internal resistance to climate as an integral part of the bank group's then mission of ending poverty and building shared prosperity was high. The data sets of the economic implications of climate impacts were incomplete and contested at country level. And translating all of the global reports on trajectories for the energy transition, implications for food security, the implications of stranded assets, and whether there was a tragedy of the horizon, and if so, why finance ministers weren't taking on this agenda, that was the backdrop of intense efforts to align multilateral development banks, other development finance actors, the IMF, and then to find ways to express this alignment in a way that boosted the likelihood of an ambitious agreement in Paris. And then there was Pete. MDBs were a world he didn't know intimately, and which he perhaps wisely didn't really want to know. We would meet and discuss climate and finance with bad tea in the offices of BASE or wherever else, or on the phone. What I had to say was often irritating to him, perhaps because he needed a result, not a journey around the plumbing of international finance. If I closed my eyes and think about those days, I have one vivid image above all others. It was towards the end of August 2015. Pete was sitting in his mum's garden. I was standing on the top of a sand dune in Cape Cod in order to get reception. The wind was blowing over my phone and the birds were singing in the garden. And we were trying to work through some choreography of the ambitious commitments on finance that would be needed long before we arrived in Paris, focusing on the World Bank and IMF annual meetings that would be in Lima 6 weeks before. Pete was a little grumpy. I was frazzled, trying to pull off something that had never happened before, and Pete's affect was a study in being wildly unimpressed by everything we were doing. I was a piece of the jigsaw puzzle that was in his head, the jigsaw puzzle that was the negotiated text, the landing zone. He was a piece of the jigsaw puzzle in my head, how to use the Paris Agreement to force faster reform of the Bretton Woods institutions so that they responded to the climate crisis. There we were, on separate sides of the Atlantic, with a thin Marconi line connecting us. But that thin line was just one strand of the web that connected Pete to so many people, then and still now, fighting for international agreement on the defining issues of our time around the world. So what would Pete think about where we are now? What would Pete think of the world almost 10 years on? Once again, countries are testing the nature and strength of the agreement and our international resolve on collective action. We have final yet contested agreement on a transition away from fossil fuels, 8 years after Paris, and forged in a modern oil and gas state. And 9 years after Paris, final and imperfect agreement on carbon markets. Oh, that it took so long. Oh, and by the way, on-trackedness, i.e. we are not on track, has now become a noun. Almost 10 years on, the Paris Agreement has worked, but it hasn't worked well enough. Since the gavel came down, we've moved from a world on track for about 4 degrees of warming or more to a world where warming is on a pathway to 2.6, 2.7. Better, but still devastating. Improved, but not safe. To be safe, we need to limit our overshoot and reach 1.5. Since Paris, we've seen a rise in populism and economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is ill-suited to global crises of living safely and fairly within planetary boundaries. But the fraying multilateralism that got us over the line in Paris has been faltering in its application, and the organizations created in a different time, a different century, a different place are weakened. Plurilateral clubs that have been the focus of efforts to keep building momentum perhaps do not have the right criteria for membership anymore. Economic clubs, the G7, the G20, no longer reflect the current need for future leadership and the necessity of that for climate action. Whither Kenya, Barbados, if we were to have a club of leaders? And since Paris, we have seen a shrinking of civic space, often in the countries with populism, but more broadly too. the space to dissent, the space for business and government to nurture the partnerships and progress that we need. This space is where we can build the support for the transitions which will deliver clean air, affordable bills, food security, flood defences, sustainable growth. At the beginning of 2025, when governments should produce the next iteration of NDCs, helping close the gap of ambition and committing to close the gap in implementation, we see storm clouds to our west. To our east, our innovation and possibility. To the north, we have a potential great game playing out over the control of the poles, the planet's thermostats, home to indigenous peoples and critical natural abundance. And to our south, we can see scepticism and doubt that the North's word is our bond, following betrayals during COVID and the benign neglect of investment and trade necessary for the energy revolution and the fairness that we need in our international financial institutions. Since Paris, the UK's place in the world has also been unclear to us. The rest of the world has watched our vacillation with bemusement, sometimes disdain, often despair. But with a new government, we are now back. But as a pragmatic partner, understanding that climate and nature can be the lens on foreign policy that allows us to reset our relationships, in particular with the global south. And the world looks to us for pragmatic leadership, whether in NDC diplomacy, in bridge building to least developed countries, to Africa, to forest nations, or within the G7. However, 10 years on, I worry that the Paris Agreement is at one of its weakest points. This spring, the International Court of Justice will opine on the case brought by Vanuatu, suggesting that countries have a legal obligation to each other and to their people to act on climate change. In the submissions made to the ICJ, Western democracies walked a fine line, recognising that we are not on track, and in parenthesis, that the reason for that is that lack of action is often at the government level, but at the same time supporting the Paris Agreement as the best kind of agreement we could possibly hope for, especially in these troubled times. The extent to which this argument suffices, when the frustration and pain of many least developed countries and small island developing states is long endured and understandably produces deep cynicism, is unclear. Couple that with the fears of collective and transparent processes by some other countries, and the fact that some other countries are questioning their participation in the treaty and in the Paris Agreement, we must work hard to protect the Paris Agreement. How? By implementing it. Implementation of the Paris Agreement and the narrative we must build around it is, as I was reminded by Indy Johar recently, about recognising our entanglement. Our energy security here in the United Kingdom depends upon the security of supply chains, which are important for the prosperity of so many other countries around the world. The energy security of people in the heart of the African continent depends on their ability to secure the renewable energy components needed for their build-out, both to ship them to African soil and then to get them logistically from the coast to the interior, all at a reasonable price. We are all entangled. And the beauty of the Paris Agreement is that in its bottom-up process of ambition and vision, planning, in some way, it celebrates our entanglement. Now we have to live it. At the same time, the Paris Agreement takes on systems change. The famous Article 2.1c talks about every element of our economic management and financial flows to evolve to support the implementation of the Paris Agreement, something which almost every country has failed to do. We have just started financial architecture reform with the Bretton Woods institutions at 80, providing that perspective. And while the strains between superpowers mean that this agenda may even become stickier, the costs of not fixing the system will increasingly become evident. We must keep plugging away. Our hosts, Brazil at COP30, need our partnership to shift focus more sharply onto implementation. Many in Brazil would argue that the most consequential meetings for Brazil's future in 2025 are not related to COP30, but related to BRICS Plus and that leadership. The truth is that they are both consequential, and we as the United Kingdom need to build partnerships with these vast, and growing economies, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, not least because if they do not succeed, then neither will we. We are embarking on an extraordinary era of clean energy, clean technology for energy, for food security, for water security, to achieve sustainable growth and development that will support burgeoning young populations around the world, no more so than in Africa, and provide security, continued prosperity for our shrinking population. This is the implementation of the Paris Agreement. This is the heart of just transition. If we falter, we can see the results, ever more frightening science on the possibilities of discontinuous change events, punishing extreme weather, rising number of conflicts and forced migration. If we succeed, we can also see the results: jobs, clean air, new technologies, increasing inclusion, better healthcare outcomes. Whether it is Harish Handy and his colleagues at Selco connecting thousands of health centres across the states of Northeast India to clean energy, or the vision of Sebastian Kind and his colleagues at RELP and iTrust, providing the energy transition toolboxes and the financial widgets that are needed to attract support and investment, we know that this can go fast sometimes. But for many policymakers, having the time and the bandwidth to look around the corners and see the future is hard. We are blessed in the UK to have a man who can, as our Secretary of State for Energy. And when you can't see what the future might look like, the temptation is to say, well, okay, steady as she goes, cautiously putting one foot in front of the other. And the implication of that is that the energy transition, in order to be smooth, should be steady. But if we look at the countries that have moved further through their energy transition, it comes in fits and starts. It moves very fast sometimes. Reactive to external events, seizing the opportunity of domestic leadership with courage, and it reacts to the alchemy of ensuring that institutions, capital and policy can occur at the same time. Our challenge is to be able to create those conditions and be prepared to go fast everywhere. So in an era of implementation, we need to do three things better. We must shift the narrative, we must organise ourselves differently for implementation, and we must reward leadership in real time. First, the narrative. We can see from the weaponisation of net zero around the world that we have much to do to win back a narrative, especially for young people. A narrative of growth, jobs and wellness that comes from a shift to clean energy and more resilience. A narrative that embraces nature. What people want is clean air, clean communities, clean energy, affordable bills, but clean energy, flood defences, and to protect our family members from extreme heat. That's a world that's envisaged in the Paris Agreement, but we can bury that lead. We don't need to lead with climate. Paris also said that we should leave no one behind. The living rooms of the working class, whether in Britain or elsewhere, or the modest houses on the edges of fast-growing cities in Africa, are not the places for the battle over choices of energy transition. They will be the beneficiaries of the policy choices we make. The battle is with incumbency and inertia, with shifts in tax codes and financial regulation, and with making polluters pay. Poorly constructed notions of growth have bedeviled moves towards sustainable development since the very beginning of the story in 1972 in Stockholm. It's not new, but we both need to shift the narrative to sustainable economic growth and force the narrative battle onto our chosen battlegrounds. The climate movement must reflect on young Germans who switched their votes last summer straight from the Greens to the AfD because they thought Green was elite. We must reflect on the loss of votes of young men across all racial groups and identities in the United States to an anti-climate change ticket in many cases. The climate movement must look to itself as we recognise that you cannot turn the switch off on dirty energy until you can switch it on to clean power. So as we help Brazil manage an extremely complex COP30, we must together with them put the focus firmly on the sustainable economic development that puts a value on standing tropical forests, which secures clean energy affordably and allows people at all income levels to put a plate of affordable, healthy food grown sustainably in front of their children. NDCs should be investable plans. Investable plans for sustainable development could be an NDC. Yes, each country is accountable for its commitments, but how many plans can we ask any government to prepare in any given year? We need to perhaps cut back on all the names of the plans and start building things. Which brings me to my second point. How do we organise ourselves better and differently for action and implementation in a different world? Let me take a little detour to make my point. At the heart of the Paris Agreement, as I've said, was the commitment to leave no one behind. But who are we leaving behind 10 years on? By 2100, 40% of the world's population will be African. Today, it's just over 12%. The median age in Africa today is just over 19. Of the 20 countries with the fastest population growth rates, all 20 are African nations. 40% of young Africans today are living in extreme poverty, and more than 20% are outside of the labour force. The opportunities for labour force participation of this incredible wealth of human ingenuity is and will be the result of the growth of renewable energy and clean energy across the continent. But then the skills that need to be developed, the training and education, have to be fit for purpose. It is one of those ultimate tests of partnership. The private sector, African governments, the international community, and young people themselves. It's just one of the ways that we have to step back, think about the problem differently, and organise ourselves to respond at scale. To run a business anywhere in the world, but including in Africa, we need reliable and affordable energy. That reliability and that affordability will come from clean energy, especially for the many hundreds of thousands who don't have any access to energy today. Yes, there's gas infrastructure in some countries which is important to build out and make efficient. And yes, we can invest more in hydro with the right hydrological analysis. And geothermal will become increasingly important for some parts of the continent, but it is to solar and wind that the continent looks. The Global Clean Power Alliance is one way to organise ourselves differently to achieve the speed of impact. Rewriting legislation governing utility structures and performance is hard. Walking uphill against entrenched interests, weak capacity in government, and managing a multitude of development partners and acronyms. Balancing a grid and regulating it so it makes smart economic decisions within the parameters of decarbonisation is hard for the same reasons. As countries learn from the experiences of recent attempts to reorganise ourselves, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships and other forms of country-led partnerships, so the international community is beginning to be focused on country platforms, basically development or economic development done well. The country is in the lead, it knows what it wants, and partners don't undermine each other and come to the table in an organised way. We bring with us a capital stack appropriate for the task in hand on the back of forward momentum of reform in the country. We sequence our interventions to support the country's plans from fiscal policy regulation of capital markets to utility and transmission reform, to policies for distribution, and at the heart, guardrails on the protection of nature, and an agenda which means that we will not leave women's needs to the end. Nothing in that previous list of things that we can do, nothing in that previous paragraph is new. It can all be found in the Paris Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals, or in financing for development or the Addis Ababa Agenda. But what hasn't kept up with our imagination of what we need to do to bring forward this world, what we haven't kept up with is the way in which governments are organised, the way that development finance is organised, and the way we work with the private sector. Fragmentation is our enemy. Fragmentation of funds, fragmentation of efforts, fragmentation of organisations. Stand in the shoes of the finance minister of any emerging market and developing economy, and you will hear that cry. So maybe we can stop talking about it and start to do it in 2025. At the same time, I think the UK, with the launch of a new soft power council, understands that the technical assistance that could come from the national grid or from any of the other pieces of our own energy revolution is a needed and much beloved sort of asset in the way in which we engage with other countries. And so we can double down on our soft power alongside the mobilisation of our finance from the City, the London Stock Exchange, through to the use of our own public funds in very imaginative ways increasingly, but to be increased in the future. So my third point is that while we get better at organising ourselves as an international community in order to be able to be responsive and supportive to countries in their plans for sustained economic growth within the context of the Paris Agreement, we also have to get better at recognising and rewarding in real time those who are making a first move, who take the initiative, who drive forward for change, whether at the national or the local level. The international climate circuit celebrates leadership, but then we move on, and the international system struggles to make big bets to come in behind those who have visionary agendas. We find it hard to organise our international support, differentiating between those who are really deserving and those who we have to stay engaged with. We celebrate the Bridgetown Initiative, but still the Caribbean sends more money north in debt service payments than we invest in the Caribbean's resilience. We herald Colombia's effort to go beyond oil and gas and then do little to rally around as Colombia is downgraded by the credit rating agencies. We deify and then we gather in the village square to tut-tut. We can link the way we organise and make clear that there is international support for those countries, those leaders that are prepared to tackle the deeply entrenched and complex unravelling of fiscal and economic policy built around a fossil fuel past. We must be ready to respond at scale to invest in the standing tropical forests to begin with that will be a focus of Brazil's presidency. We must be ready, for example, to ensure that our domestic regulations don't get in the way of the UK's domiciled investors seizing these new opportunities. The Global Clean Power Alliance is one way for us to marshal like-minded countries and leaders and the resources at their disposal behind those willing to put their necks out. And anyone in elected office knows it is tough to make change, and there is a much needed camaraderie as well as real support needed as we move through these complicated and interlinked transitions. If we can shift our narrative, organise ourselves differently, and move purposefully for implementation, and this will mean that we have to have small funereal moments for some acronyms, maybe some funds, and perhaps even some organisations. But we can pool funding more flexibly and at greater scale. We can respond with greater agility. And if we can signal and demonstrate international support for leadership in real time, we can build positive change and instill the confidence that is needed for the complex business of change. Perhaps we can even begin to rebuild trust. Finally, an epilogue with Pete in mind. Whenever the climate world has hit a bump in the road, we have rallied around optimism. This has been an important rallying cry for many in the global north. I have to admit that I have always found optimism difficult. I struggle with it, not being optimistic, but the concept of optimism. I'm always concerned that in my mind, it is portrayed as sort of wishing for a miracle or some kind of outer body thing that might happen. My own thinking and inspiration, my own sort of deep introspection has always been around hope. As Michelle Obama noted, hope implies somehow deep inside a commitment to be part of the change. It just seemed to resonate with me more than optimism. But as the mood has darkened in recent weeks and cruelty has come to the fore in many international relations, I continue to struggle with my framing of hope. And then, as you do, I was sitting at my desk at home with Desert Island discs on quietly in the background. Nick Cave, the musician, was the guest soon to be marooned. And then as he reflected on the difficult moments in his life and how he kept going and how he persevered, he noted that for him, hope is optimism with a broken heart. For those of us working to build more sustainable development, to end our war on nature, to ensure that everyone benefits from an era where we can produce reliable, affordable and clean energy, and therefore to protect and make more perfect the Paris Agreement, we must keep calm, We must carry on and be hopeful while acknowledging our broken hearts. Thank you.
Well, goodness, thank you so much, Rachel, but also Fiona, Secretary of State, Nick, for setting us off on the right path tonight. And thank you, Rachel, I think, for giving us the challenges, the context, but most importantly, the solutions, and maybe giving us a bit of hope as well as we face all of those. So thank you. And so just a quick reflection from me, because Fiona, you said at the beginning that Pete would have loved this. He really would. He loved a challenge. He loved geopolitics. He loved getting down and really thinking about what was going on in the world and what could we do about it to make the world better and to respond to those challenges. And finding new partnerships, finding new solutions, coming together and thinking through those together, asking questions of each other, are exactly what Pete was about. And when I think of Paris, I think about Pete. Although I didn't see him a huge amount at Paris, he was buried deep in huddles and negotiations. But I also think of him at our Christmas party just after Paris, our infamous Christmas parties where we all come together and celebrated. And Pete was there dressed as Asterix to celebrate the Paris connection, fast asleep, while the team partied around him, because Pete had given his all to Paris and he had given his all to the team as well to get us there. So I'm 2 weeks into this new job, following in Pete's footsteps. And I think online, I know there are lots of people watching, and I think Archie and Alison are also online and watching. And I've got huge shoes to fill. But 2 weeks in, lots of things from Pete resonate a lot in my mind. One thing I've been walking around thinking is very much, what would Pete do? We need to get T-shirts made of that. We need Carve here to make us T-shirts. I've asked for a punt. And I've been asking questions. So that's what we're getting to now. We're getting to questions. This is why tonight is important. It's about coming together. It's about listening. It's about learning. But fundamentally, it's also about talking to each other. And that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to take some questions from all of you. There are fantastic people roaming around with microphones. We've got about 25 minutes. So please put up your hand. I'll take a few questions in little groups, if that's all right with you, Rachel, and just let us know roughly who you are and where you're from.
I just want to note the incredible collective intelligence in this room. It's a bit scary to sit up here looking at you all, and I'm going to take the liberty of deflecting some of the questions to better placed people in the audience.
You're warned. Okay, I can see hand back here and then hand in the middle, and then we'll come to the front. We'll take those three to start with.
Thank you so much. Quickly, just introducing myself. I am currently a student at the Oxford University in the MBB program, Kangshi here. And I'm here also for Rachel because she's one of the teaching faculties there. The question really here is, and I will start with where Rachel left, which is the broken heart and the optimism. So when Mr. Trump has decided to pull out of the Paris Agreement, I see the optimism for the UK to really be a global leader in the space, because there is a lot of steering that the global South is relying on when it comes to global financing for climate change. On that note particularly, what are some of the breakthroughs that you have seen in the past, the mindset shift from the private that is coming into financing the needs both of the global South, but also creating very sustainable jobs across these trajectories, right? Like it's not only global South, but global North as well, which will need those jobs. Also with the immigration policies becoming stronger in both these regions. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, if we can, right into the middle.
Thanks so much for a very excellent speech, Rachel. It's lovely to see you again. I love your 3 points of actions, and the narrative, changing the narrative is really important. I'm just wondering, isn't part of the narrative why it's wrong is that we still are pursuing endless GDP growth on a finite planet? And isn't part of the problem with the narrative and power dynamic internationally, the mindset of growth is very much a Western ideology baked into Bretton Woods Institute, while indigenous wisdom and many of the global South economic models teach us it's about thriving balance. So how do we move to that reframing the narrative as well? Thank you.
At front.
Thanks. Nick Gowing from the Thinking the Unthinkable project. Can I just pick up on that particular point on narrative? Because actually, Rachel and I have talked about this several times before you entered government, Rachel, but much more broadly, it came out time and time again in Davos 2 weeks ago, the need for a new narrative. And now you've put it as number 1 out of 3. How is this achievable? Because I would suggest to you that many governments, most governments, including this government, simply have not really engaged on the potential for actually convincing the public by having a much better narrative, not least one that is understandable and is not overwhelmed by net zero sustainability and so on, makes it accessible for them.
You know, I was joking the other day that I was going to change my job title to the UK Special Representative for Common Sense. Probably, I thought I could probably travel more freely, and that probably describes the job, because just to sort of link a little bit, you know, I was in Tanzania last week at this an energy summit, and you know, whatever the globe, you know, whatever the storm clouds are on the horizon of our current geopolitics, the enormity of the investment opportunity, if countries can just get some of the frameworks right, how to build a modern utility and regulate it, how to regulate transmission that will work for renewable energy supply. I mean, you know, this is a hyperpower of energy and minerals, right? And if we can just get it right, which is what everybody was focused on. And so, you know, people were reading the news, but that wasn't the focus. And on Monday, I accompanied Annalisa Dodds, our Minister for Development, to the London Stock Exchange, where we celebrated the recent listing of the CCMM, which is a mechanism which took many, many, many years to design, but the point is it is now done, where we took a performing portfolio of renewable energy and other green infrastructure assets in the climate investment funds, which were dreamt up in and around the time of Copenhagen, and listed that as a bond on the London Stock Exchange, and it was immediately 6 times oversubscribed. And over the course of the lifetime of that bond, it's going to raise $7.5 billion to go back into the climate investment funds to then go on and be relent into these things. And that's the first one. It took years to do, and the legal stuff was really difficult. The treasury operation was unbelievable, you know, but now we know how to do it. So now we're going to do that for other funds, and now we're going to start doing that for every regional development bank, and it's going to be in London, and London is going to be the place where everybody wants to come to list. And so these are the things that I think give me the hope or the optimism. I've got many other examples, but I'll move quickly on. I think so there have been multiple efforts ever since the beginning of GDP, right? When those who created it sort of said, don't use this for health and education and the environment. And what did we do? There have been multiple efforts over multiple years to start to move, you know, for countries to use shadow non-GDP measures. Of course, some countries have introduced everything from well-being indices to happiness indices to other indices. Natural capital accounting comes up every decade at the World Bank, and all the economists sit around and scratch their heads, and then we move on to another crisis, and eventually we are going to have to find some other way to account for wealth. It's probably going to come from a coalition of countries whose wealth is still in nature, And I think that, you know, London and the UK are one of the great places which should be pushing for that experimentation. Whether you run it as a shadow or at what point you transfer over from one way to another, I don't know. But this has to become increasingly important. And then on the narrative, I don't think we can ignore what people want. And people want to feel safe, and people want to feel free. And people can only feel safe and free when a process of economic development is going on around and with them. And what helps you feel that? Well, that you can afford the basics, that you can, that you have a clean community, that you can breathe clean air. And I think we have to recognize that a lot of the narrative began to feel very elite as people started to feel less well off. There are things that we need to do so that they are not less well off and that they don't feel less well off. And we need to keep that narrative. And I think the other point of this is nature. All of the polling, all of the evidence show that wherever you are on the political spectrum, actually, and wherever you are in any age category and any income category, nature is intrinsically important to you and increasingly recognized as so, especially by young people. And if you look at the election results in July last year, I mean, you know, you have blue voters voting green, you had red voters voting green, you had green voters voting yellow. I mean, like, everybody was being quite tactical in some respects. But the theme of nature was definitely there in almost every part of the country, and we have to recapture that.
Great, thank you. We're going to go upstairs for this next sort of questions. We've got Michael, we've got one in the front, anyone, and one at the back. Perfect.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm Michael Button, like many people here, formerly of the UK COP negotiating team and now at IGCC. My question for you, Rachel, was, you set out 3 very important but challenging things for us to work on. Where do you see the Paris Agreement 10 years from now, if we are able to make progress on those things?
Thank you very much. I wanted to bring it towards the UK and Europe. We recognise that, frankly, in the UK and Europe, the policy environment for enabling sustainable generators and sustainable sources of energy is fantastic. The limiting reagent often is things like grid capacity and the way that the grid is currently built and developed. And it was not developed in the way that we are going to need to use it, centrally being decentralization, smaller units, and a more dynamic balancing mechanism and way that we clear the market. And so I wanted to understand how we approach redeveloping something as incumbent and something as comprehensive as the national grid, for example. How do you even start to approach building a grid? Because we in Europe may be one of the first sorts of countries to really have to engage with this issue and then lead by example with how other nations can remodel their grid. How do you even at a policy level or at a national level go about changing something as old and as ever present as the grid structure?
At the back.
Hi there, my name's Katie from M&C Saatchi. We're working with lots of activists who are pushing the just transition agenda, and many of them feel very disappointed from the last COP in terms of the visibility and alignment around that conversation. And I would just love to hear your perspective as we head into COP in Brazil, the extent to which you think that's going to get traction and how it will show up, and any, I guess, challenges around that agenda.
Okay. So health warning, I am the climate envoy facing overseas. My boss is sitting in the front row. You should talk to Chris Stark about all the many, many, many amazing things that are already underway with only 7 months in office. And I was talking to Chris earlier this week, and we were talking about the incredible synergy between the investment promotion that we're doing overseas, about the amount of investment that the UK can receive and can usefully use in our own energy transition. And then, of course, our ability to invest in the energy transitions of other countries. And I think whether we're building cabling, on the River Clyde, because you have to wait far too long to connect a wind array to the grid here or anywhere else in the world, or all of the extraordinary job opportunities that come from all of the high tech at the top of a wind turbine. These are extraordinary opportunities here and extraordinary opportunities for us overseas. And we are looked to already for our know-how on pieces of how we have managed the transition so far and the way in which the national grid in particular and others approach this problem. So we have technical partnerships with China, with India and others, something that we will build out in the next few years. And I think that the style of this government is that as we learn, so we will share, and we can also learn from others. So the Global Clean Power Alliance is about focusing on the obstacles to speeding the transition, so that there's probably 10 interconnectors in the world that are really, really more important than others. All your children are lovely, but some are, So what are those 10? Let's get them built, right? Where are the 12 grids in the world where we are we're uneconomically dispatching because we're dispatching fossil fuel energy before renewables because of the way in which the grid is regulated. We have initiatives on these issues, but we want to supercharge them. So that's my sort of delicate non-answering of a question which would only get me into trouble. Paris Agreement in 10 years, well, it will still exist. It will still exist. And the Paris Agreement in 10 years, if we do as I think the Brazilians would like and as we understand and focus on implementation, then the kinds of NDCs that are coming through, these nationally determined contributions, when we add them all up, they will not get us back on track. I mean, that's my sort of bet on the 5th of February, right? We're seeing a softening of ambition from some countries in their NDCs, but they are not set in time and they're not static. They're floors, not ceilings. And as we start moving through, then they can improve their ambition over time, as we tried to in Glasgow. And what that means is that we need to really line up behind. So for example, Brazil's NDC is a range. The bottom of the range is not really on track for a 1.5 degree world. The top of the range is. The top of the range is difficult politically, domestically. The top of the range requires marshalling our investment and partnership behind their energy transition, behind their mineral development and the future of their mining industry, behind the way in which they manage land and forests, and the way in which they develop a modern manufacturing economy. If we can do that, then we get to the top of the range. Then we will have a Paris Agreement because we will have been focused on implementation. This possibly asks big questions of what kind of secretariat you need and other UN minutiae, but we can take that over a drink around the corner later. And then just on just transition, look, COP29, the president of COP29 took a very narrow view of what was at stake and what was going to be focused on. And many creative ideas and issues, from justice to gender to nature, almost completely ended up on the cutting room floor as we zeroed in on really just a very, very narrow set of issues. Brazil will not do that. The Brazilian COP is different in that we're at a different point in the cycle. We now have to take all these NDCs and fashion that into the next period of implementation. But I think because of the nature of their democracy, because of the nature of their development story, these things will stay at the front. So I understand the frustration. And we as a delegation were frustrated too, in some respects. But this is something that Brazil will allow to breathe again.
Great, okay, let's get some more. Loads of hands have gone up. Okay, so then the question is, you've got to make your questions short and succinct so we can get through lots. Okay, over here, Claire and James. And we'll come round and get some more. Excellent.
Jones, BCG. One of the other reflections.
We're going to pass you a microphone just so other people can hear.
Jones, BCG. One of the other reflections from Davos that I've heard was that business was not stepping back from climate sustainability, but struggling in the same way that governments are struggling to make progress, and looking for much more practical means of cooperation with government on this. And so looking beyond the national agenda, Rachel, as you said, isn't your purview, but at the COP, what can the COP do in the way that it goes about this to better engage business on making progress? Thanks.
Similar to my questions, I'll build on that. Claire Sakier with the Nature Conservancy. Given where we are right now with the storm in the west, I think you called it, Rachel, what do we need, and indeed the sort of ODA cuts in Europe, what are the contours of actually getting and rebuilding confidence in real ambition right now?
And we need to run a microphone back here.
Thank you, Rachel. James Close from NatWest Group. Lovely to see you, and great to be with you again. I'm going to channel my inner memory of peak bets after a meeting we had at the World Bank with a group of philanthropy organisations, pension funds, politicians. I think you were there, Nick, as well, Al Gore and others. And I rather giddily came to speak to Nick the next morning and told him about this wonderful meeting and how we were going to mobilise finance for climate. And he sort of slightly stoically looked at me and said, "Oh yes, the Holy Grail." I just wonder, and Nick, you've obviously done great work with Vera Songwe as well around this. I just wonder how you feel about the mobilisation of blended finance for climate, and particularly in a period where Africa is seeing capital outflows rather than capital inflows. And what can we do about it, particularly those of us who have a lever on the private finance tiller?
So I don't know if Nick wants to add something, but very briefly on all three. So I think we've gone through different phases of business engagement with government, right? So we've gone through a lot of finger pointing. Well, if you do that, then I can do that. No, but if you do that, I can. And so we have to move beyond that. As I said in my lecture, I think the civic space for business engagement has really closed down in some certain parts of the world, either because of fears of antitrust or the rise of populism, or every time I say populism, that happens. So I think we have to continue to create that space, not just at the COPs, but at the B20s and whatever. And I think at the national level, then finding the space, if it isn't there, for a sustained dialogue. And it's about in the developed world, it's about the way in which we regulate the financial sector and the business sector that gets in the way of their ability to not only do the things at home that we need them to do, but to do the things internationally that we need them to do. I think there are always silver linings, and so even though we've seen a number of financial institutions leaving some of their clubs, maybe there's a little heat needed to be taken out of the balloon so that people started believing again, and we can get back into a more honest narrative about what regulation is needed for them to be able to do what we want them to do, and build on what works, which is partly an answer to what James was asking, but we do a very, very bad job, I think, of stewarding our resources, which are finite and shrinking, into the things which get the greatest impact. And maybe when a necessity is the motherhood of invention, the kind of squeeze that we've got on public resources because of Ukraine and because of Syria and rebuilding of Gaza and because of the refugee crisis that was of previous years, then maybe if we can use our resources to really be much more focused on leverage, where leverage would actually work, and much more focused on the sequencing, because we sort of run around like headless chickens. So we've got to leverage finance, we've got to leverage finance. Yeah, and there's nothing to invest in because there's no utility reform and there's no grid. And so I think that we can be more disciplined and much greater impact. And then the precious money the ODA or whatever other form of grant money that we will generate from new revenue sources in future years, that then gets used for the technical assistance, for the subsidies that have to be used, for the social safety nets that no country can use private money for. So I think that it's not ideal, but I think maybe this sort of moment forces us into a discipline that we should have found more recently. And then what was it? Oh yeah. Well, there you go. Nick, do you want to add?
You covered most of it, Rachel. I think the tripling by 2030 of the financial flows from the MDBs is key, because if that happens and you have a little bit of the very low cost money that Rachel mentioned, then your partnership with the private sector can kick in very strongly, and the MDBs in various forms through long-term loans, equity guarantees, first loss offsets and so on, can take risk that the private sector finds difficult to take. That tripling of the MDBs, well, part of it will be working their balance sheets a bit more strongly. Part of it would be paid in capital. The paid in capital that would be necessary would probably be about 10 billion a year. This is the MDBs as a whole, the whole system, for 8 to 10 years. 10 billion a year for 8 to 10 years, and that triples. It goes well over 200 billion a year in lending. It is fantastic value for money, large measure from the genius of Keynes and paid in and callable capital. The UK's contribution to that might be £500 million a year, sort of 5%. I mean, that's peanuts to get the whole thing multiplied up by that. Would the Americans get in the way? Probably. But this is the MDBs as a system. Yeah, they're not shareholders in the AIIB. They're not Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They're not shareholders in the European Investment Bank, to take two big important examples. They're not the dominant shareholders in a whole collection of other MDBs. So this is perfectly feasible. This is a moment when the UK and Europe, and indeed China and India, can lead. And remember, when somebody steps back, there's a space. And there's a lot of thinking now about how to step into that space. We heard Ursula von der Leyen speak in Davos. Our Chinese friends are thinking very seriously about that. Just a week or so ago, the foreign secretaries, that's at the senior civil service level, the top senior civil service level in India and China, got together. And they decided, it's a small thing, but they decided to reinstate flights from Delhi to Beijing. Otherwise, you can't go. And they're often when I want to go. But that's an example. I mean, it's just a flag. But that's an example of other people, when there's a stepping back, when there's a space, thinking through how they're going to step in. And I think we're seeing that already in a number of aspects of international politics. And we can and should see that in the MDBs.
Right, there are lots of hands. We're just getting warmed up, but we are also about to have to end. So I'm going to take one question from upstairs and one from downstairs, but you have to promise me it's a quick fire question, and then we'll pass quickly to close with a quick fire answer. Absolutely. So from upstairs, gentleman here, downstairs, benefit from being in my line of sight.
Hi, my name's Akar. I'm a environmental economics student here at the LSE. My question to you is about voluntary carbon markets. On the topic of finance and directing finance to developing nations, do you think VCMs will have an important role to play over the next 10 years? And the integrity issues that we've seen and experienced, do you think there are ways to resolve them? Things like Article 6, etc. Really keen to get your reflections on that. Thank you.
Great. And
our Article 6 negotiator sitting right down here. If you want to buy him a drink afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I wrote the question down so I don't ramble. I work at Climate Policy Initiative, an organization that you were a part of prior to your appointment. I come from Pakistan, a country that suffered massively due to the incredible debt burdens that have been placed and that are characteristic of many developing countries. Almost half of our budget goes into interest payments. Not even the principal. That doesn't even include the principal. So that's half of the budget of the country. I work in the blended finance, project finance space, and there I see immense potential to create change. There's a question on blended finance, and this is within sort of the broader international financial architecture. I see you're smiling, so I think you probably know what I'm getting to. I fear that fiscal support creates room for bad actors and bad incentives, and those undermine democracies, which is arguably what has happened in Pakistan with the coup in 2022. It also undermines industrial policy and the protection of domestic industries, something I see as being potentially critically important for countries like Pakistan to get back on track, especially when big economies like China and the US are exercising such policies. So do you believe there is a universe in which we can make the IMF work for countries like Pakistan, a country that is utterly addicted to fiscal support at this point with very little focus on structural reform and industrial policy?
Seriously. I should get danger pay. Okay. So voluntary carbon markets, yes, I think that done well, they are a big part of the future revenue for emerging markets, developing economies. We need to send strong signals to business that we want them to engage with integrity in these markets, and we need to support the capacity of countries to work through a whole vista of how carbon is sort of coming over the horizon, right? We've got CBAMs, we've got voluntary carbon markets, we've got Article 6, we've got a 6.2 bilateral and now a 6.4 and others. Countries need to work out how do they approach carbon markets. And so this, I think, is a much bigger part of our technical assistance and our support. I've been running around after the World Bank and others to sort of really step up, and I think the coalition of finance ministers for climate need to take the carbon markets on so that we've got that political leadership as well. And I know that as the UK, we've engaged now with the coalition again after a few years of being absent. And yes, basically. IMF, yes. Why? Because I don't think the IMF can afford to not to. Actually, it's I'm not an economist, so I'm saying this with trepidation, but it's a little bit too small at the moment to do all the things we want it to do, and it's too big to be ignored, right? So how it does that. I think that Kristalina Georgieva has talked and leaned into the climate and development agenda vigorously. She's now got a second term, so now you can be even bolder. She does not have an aligned board. That board is 50-50 around whether or not climate is really anything to do with its traditional role, despite the fact that it was Christine Lagarde that first talked about the macroprudential risk related to climate, and despite the sort of harrying by Nick Stern and others over many years. So this is a period where that board is going to have to respond to global events. It's going to have to respond to the multiplying the cost of climate impacts, and it's going to have to respond to the way that we will not get out of the debt burden, the debt distress, and the liquidity stress that countries are under if climate impacts just keep rolling and hitting and hitting. So it's only going to get more expensive. And at some point, hopefully, we will, as a community of nations on that board, come to that realization.
Thank you, thank you. It's up to me now to thank all those who were involved. Ed Davey in the front, Bob Ward at the back. Thank you so much for making this splendid event happen and so well organized, and to all those involved here at LSE in that organization. Fiona, thank you so much for bringing us together and for your warmth and strength and inspiration, which continues so strongly. Kyte, can you take that message of Pete's excellence, inspiration, energy, vision living on in you guys? Because it really does. And I thought Ed captured that so well. We really do have something to offer. And some parts of our civil service are absolutely outstanding. Ed, thank you so much for your leadership over so many years you've been on this case. You know, and you've made the case very powerfully, that the drive to net zero is the drive to growth, and a much better form of growth than the dirty, destructive models of the past. Not that old growth, something much better. You know it, that case is very powerful. It's particularly powerful now. At the next cabinet meeting, you could mention that you were here at the LSE, and that message came through very clearly and strongly, including from our special representative on climate. And if they have any doubts at all, tell them to come along and we'll help them. But thank you again, Ed, and thank you particularly for being here. I know how tough it is as a cabinet minister to spend the time, but I know your love of the issue and your love of Pete. So thank you so much. Rachel, that was just wonderful. I guess we knew it would be, but of course you have to come along to feel in what way it is wonderful, and we did. And the way you set it out was very clear and strong. And we all struggle with pessimism and optimism. But I always think of what Jacques Delors said. He said, I struggle with pessimism and optimism, but what about activism? And that's what you showed us today. And that's what I think is of special importance. Pete would have been happy to have been here. He'd have given us a hard time, he'd have cross-questioned, but he'd been happy to be here. So as you express your thanks to all those involved in this, and as you express your applause, please also think of Pete. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to those online also. Thank you.
So all the records have been